Great. Well, thanks for coming, everyone. On this, rainy. It looks like the rain might have stopped now, so that's a good omen for us. Welcome. My name is Jason Oliver Chang. I'm Associate Professor of History and Asian American Studies here at UConn. I'm also a director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute. And we're just so thrilled and pleased to be able to offer this week-long extended academic programming on Sikh American history, culture, and politics in recognition of the undeniable place of Sikh immigrants in shaping Asian American history from the 19th century indenture and colonial displacement to their commitment to social justice, anti-racism, and coalitions for democracy and human rights in the 21st century. So I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Sikh Art Gallery in Norwich and the NEAG School of Education for helping to put on this awesome program. The Institute, the Asian American Studies Institute, is animated by its core mission to conduct research on and teach anti-racism. And since responding to the surge in anti-Asian racism during the pandemic, we're committed to broad educational change here in Connecticut and join the Sikh community who knows all too well the importance of education in fighting racism after the surge of attacks on their community after September 11th. And continued persecution and hate-based attacks and discrimination. So recent tragedies like the senseless death of Janavi Kandula in Seattle, being struck by a speeding police car, and the murder of Hardy Singh Nijjar illustrate the urgent need for our education work to continue. The Institute is a leader in the state for supporting legislation and community organizing to make Asian American and Pacific Islander studies a required area of work for all public schools, pre-K through 12. So the Institute's curriculum lab is now involved in building a model curriculum for use across the state, aligned with standards and supported by scholarship and community involvement. So in order to do this work justice, we know that a deeper understanding of our diverse Asian American communities and our shared history is vital, since the majority of Connecticut's Asian American population moved here after the year 2000. For this reason, Sikh Studies Week covers a broad range of events, from scholars and community leaders, advocates, and cultural workers. Building off of our other K-12 API curriculum implementation programs, we're working for an inclusive ethnic studies curriculum in Connecticut. So, however, we want to make sure that the diversity of Asian American communities are represented in ways that build connections and inspire everyone. So for too long, the story about Sikh American discrimination has focused too much on their misidentification as Muslim or Hindu, right? And thus missing an essential story in the making of Asian America. So by broadening the conversation of who Sikh Americans are in their own words, we can better understand the tragedies which have shaped the global diaspora, as well as the tremendous courage and resilience they've shown in our shared struggle for democracy, justice, and human rights. And since we're talking about educating for a peaceful and prosperous future, we need to highlight the cultural practices and community organizations which create joy and healing for our community as well. So all of the events in Sikh Studies Week, in the Sikh Studies Week program, will be recorded and shared freely to support ongoing learning and access. So we can continue to support our educators here and elsewhere. We'll be working to include accurate and relevant lessons in API studies. So for our first event in Sikh Studies Week, I am so proud to have with us Harman Singh. Harman is the Policy and Education Coordinator of the Sikh Coalition, the nation's largest Sikh civil rights organization. And in this role, he oversees the policy and education program areas. On the policy front, he manages legislative and executive advocacy at the state and federal levels around measures to combat hate crimes, school bullying, workplace discrimination, and racial profiling. In terms of education, It works to advance the Sikh Coalition's multi-year advocacy in the area of state standards curricula to ensure that classrooms are more inclusive and that Sikhi is taught appropriately and accurately in public schools across the nation. When I embarked on this work to help transform education, Harman was in every room that I ended up being in. And it was so exciting to learn from you and the work that you've done. And now that we're in this space where we see this work being taken up in other spaces, it's so tremendous to have a partner like you in this work. Harman, welcome. So glad that you're here with us today. Yeah.
All right. So I just want to start first by thanking Dr. Chang, University of Connecticut. It's really been an amazing journey working with Dr. Chang and the university on a lot of initiatives that we're doing with the Sikh Coalition and just broadly fighting for more inclusive social studies standards. And so really happy to be here to kick off this week's event and to share more about the Sikh community. So I'll start with a little bit of background about our organization because it's certainly relevant to a lot of the work that we do and why I'm here today. The Sikh Coalition, as Dr. Chang mentioned, the nation's largest Sikh civil rights organization. We were really founded on the heels of September 11th in response to a lot of the hate, violence, and discrimination the Sikh community knew it would be subjected to. And so over the past 20 plus years, the Sikh Coalition has really worked to advance a number of different program areas and really try to take a very holistic approach to the challenges we know the Sikh community is experiencing. And so we have a cross-programmatic strategy that includes our legal team, which takes in over 200 intakes a year from Sikhs who are victims of hate crimes, workplace discrimination, and school bullying. Our legal team also takes a very proactive approach to combat discrimination. That includes filing amicus briefs for the Supreme Court and also broadly consulting on very important legislation that would impact the community. Dr. Chang mentioned our policy and advocacy team. We have both the state and federal component to our work to really address some of the needs that we know the Sikh community and other marginalized communities within the civil rights space are also experiencing. We have an education team, which looks to advance more inclusive social studies standards and address problems of school bullying. We're a national organization, but we also have a grassroots approach. And so we have a community development team. They work directly with community members across the United States to make sure they're empowered and have the resources they need to be able to advocate for the Sikh community. And finally, we have a media and communications team. They do both a proactive and reactive approach. And so one of the things we'll talk about is the Sikh community is often presented only in response to being victims of hate. And so one of the things we try to do is uplift stories about the Sikh community that otherwise would not be told, and also make sure that when people are reporting about the Sikh community, they're doing so accurately with information vetted by the community itself. So before we jump into this, I just want to hit on a few basic housekeeping things. So these are questions that often come up when we present. The first question is often just in terms of how is Sikhism pronounced. So the preferred pronunciation is Sikh. You'll oftentimes hear people say Sikh. That's really a remnant of the British being in India. And so the British pronounce it as Sikh, and that's stuck in many cases. But the preferred pronunciation from the Sikh community is Sikh. The second thing I'll clarify is that there are two ways you might hear about the Sikh community. One is Sikhi, the other is Sikhism. Again, these are colonial roots, right? Sikhism did not exist prior to the British. It was called Sikhi. But given the fact that British colonialism really impacted how the community spoke about itself and how it was defined, Sikhism came into formation at that point. And then one of the final things we like to just start by clarifying, because this is often a misconception, is that Sikhi is an independent faith. It is distinct and unique in the sense that it has its own scriptures, its own belief system, its own houses of worship, its own spiritual leaders. We'll touch on all of those things, but there's often this misconception that Sikhi is a blend of Hinduism and Islam or a sect of another religion, but it is in fact an independent world faith. All right. One of the things we like to also just mention right at the top is that Sikhism is the world's fifth largest religion. This is oftentimes surprising to folks because it's often not included anywhere in our social studies standards. These numbers are obviously not about a popularity contest. It's not about one religion being better than the other due to the number of followers. It's really just to contextualize this idea that although most people in the United States do not know about the Sikh faith, Uh, Across the world, it's the fifth largest world religion. We'll touch on why it is that a lot of folks are not familiar with the Sikh faith, but we do like to start with that bit of contextualization, especially being here in the United States. So, Sikhi emerged in the Punjab region of South Asia. You can see it on the map here. So this is where Sikhi originated. The reason I say in the Punjab region of South Asia and I don't name a country, it is because that region of Punjab is now divided between Pakistan and India, right? So when the British left that area of Punjab, it was actually divided into two. And so the birthplace of Sikhi is actually divided into two different countries at the moment. And so for a lot of folks like me, my grandparents grew up in what is now modern-day Pakistan. And through the partition, were forcefully required to move to the other side, to East Punjab, where what is now India today. And so Sikhi is one of the world's youngest religions. That's the reason a lot of folks do not know a lot about it. It originated in 1469, so it's the youngest major world religion. And you can see from this image where Sikhs have kind of immigrated to all across the world. Some of the key places that you can kind of find on the map is in the United Kingdom, Canada, United States, and Australia. Those are some of the largest Sikh populations. We're obviously going to focus primarily here on the United States, just to talk about Sikh American history, but certainly there are large diaspora populations all over the world. So Sikhs originally migrated from Punjab to California. That was one of the major entry points for the community. I think like a lot of Asian American communities, that was oftentimes the entryway into the United States, just given immigration patterns. Again, like a lot of other immigrant communities from Asia, Sikhs began oftentimes working in railroads. Sikhs also worked in the farming industry in California. For those who were in Dr. Ching's class this morning, we talked a little bit about Sikh farmers and how a lot of the reasons Sikhs began to farm in California is because the Punjab region of South Asia is primarily an agricultural state. And so the vast majority of Sikhs that were emigrating from Punjab to California were farmers already. We give an opportunity to farm in California. It made a ton of sense because the skill sets overlapped. They were able to jump right in and farm there as well. The other interesting thing here in terms of migration from Punjab to California is just that the temperature, the climate, all of that is very similar from Punjab to California. So it became a much easier transition for folks that were initially migrating to the United States. Now, obviously, since the time of migration over 125 years ago to the United States, Sikhs have migrated throughout the country. The second place that you would find Sikhs migrate after the initial journey to California was primarily on the East Coast in New York and across the coast right now. And so, today, if you were to ask where the majority of Sikhs here in the United States, California would still be near the top of the list. The New York, New Jersey area would be in the top. And then other places kind of scattered. So, places like the DC, Virginia, Maryland area. And then there's growing populations in states that you might not expect. So Indiana has a very large Sikh population. And actually Jackson, Mississippi has a growing population right now as well. Again, it's interesting. I love to talk about how these kind of migration patterns happen. Some of the reasons you're seeing a lot of Sikhs move to places like Indiana and Mississippi is actually they're moving from the coast into the middle of the country. Sikhs today are some of the largest demographics of the trucking industry in the United States. And due to that fact that they're in the trucking industry, living in the Midwest or the South sometimes is a bit more advantageous to do that work because you can get to either coast a little bit easier. So if you're a Sikh truck driver in Fresno, California, and you have to drop a load off in New York, that is a much longer journey than if you're in Indiana and you can get to either coast a little bit easier and then make your way back home a little bit easier as well. So those are some growing populations, and beyond that, there's obvious economic factors in terms of cost of living that are driving folks from the Sikh community into places like the Midwest and the South. And so just some quick history about the Sikh community. I touched on some of this, but you can see some of the images here of early Sikh immigrants to the United States. Those are early Sikh farmers in the top left-hand corner in the late 1800s. To this day, some of the largest farms in California are owned by Sikhs. So I think the largest peach farm in the country is a Sikh. It's really just through, multiple generations of Sikh farmers in California, they were able to develop their own farms. The top right-hand corner is the first Sikh Gurdwara. Gurdwara is a house of worship for the Sikh community. That was built in Stockton, California in 1912. You'll probably notice in that picture, if you look very closely, it is all men that are in that picture. That is because largely the early Sikh immigrants were all men that were migrating from Punjab. Again, similar to a lot of immigration patterns for many immigrant communities, men were leaving home to go make a living abroad, and they would oftentimes send money back or be able to go back if they were able to save up enough money to provide for their families. But again, one of the interesting stories kind of included in all of this is many of those Sikh men who first immigrated from Punjab to California ended up marrying Mexican women who were also working on the farms. And so there's a fairly large Punjabi Mexican community in California that originated when it was largely men that were migrating from Punjab to California. The bottom left-hand corner is the Leaf Singh Song. He was the first Asian American congressman elected in 1957. He was a Sikh. Then also just want to mention, again, just given some of the dynamics here, that Sikh women also obviously eventually came over to the United States as men were able to kind of establish themselves. And oftentimes the women were also working on the farms and also in lumber mills to be able to provide for their families. So super, super quick historical context of the Sikh community's immigration to the United States. So I'll touch briefly on some of the Sikh values, because obviously that's important to kind of consider as we're talking about the Sikh community. I'll start by saying the most important aspect of the Sikh faith, the place that we all kind of begin, is this idea of Ek Om God, which means there is one. So Sikh scripture literally begins with the numeral 1 to signify there is one God. Now, the concept of this one God is very interesting. The idea is that this one divine light, this one God, whatever you may want to call it, exists within all of humanity. And so every single person on this earth has that one light within inside them. And because there's this idea that there is this one light inside every human being, there are 3 core pillars of Sikhism. The first is Nam Japna, which is meditation upon God. The second is Ban Shakna, which means to earn an honest living. And the third is Gurdwara, which means to share your resources, time, and everything that you have with others. So I'll touch briefly on Nam Japna, because this is a really core part of the Sikh belief system. The idea is that through meditation, you're actually able to experience the divine while you're here on earth. So the idea is that if you meditate, and if you really find a way to connect to God, you're able to do so while you are here. And so you don't need to wait until an afterlife in order to find that connection with the one. The second idea of Ban Shakna, to earn an honest living, it actually extends beyond that. So it's to earn an honest living. It's also to live an honest life with integrity. So the idea is that through every action that you take, you should be both meditating upon God, but also living it with integrity and honestly. And the third is Gurdwara, which is, again, sharing with others. But what you're sharing could be your time, it could be your resources, it could be your money, it could be your knowledge. The idea is that you are to share with everyone around you. And again, all of these ideas stem from this idea of Ek Om God, which means there is one. So it's important to consider where these beliefs come from. In the Sikh faith, there's this idea of the gurus, right? So a lot of you may have heard the word guru before. It's in common lexicon here in the West. But within the Sikh ideology, there's a specific definition of guru. So guru within the Sikh context means someone who brings you from darkness into light. So guru is darkness, the guru is light. So the idea is the guru takes you from a sense of darkness within your conscience into enlightenment. So within the Sikh context, there were 10 living gurus from 1469 until 1708. It was an unbroken chain of human beings that were here on this earth. And the last living guru, Guru Gobind Singh, has the eternal guruship onto the Guru Granth Sahib. The Guru Granth Sahib is the image you see here. The Guru Granth Sahib is an embodiment of the Guru's teaching. It guides Sikhs. I wouldn't call it a holy book in the sense that it is not a book that you would carry with you. It's actually revered as a guru. So when you enter a Gurdwara, a Sikh house of worship, you literally bow your head and towards the guru because you're bowing towards the knowledge that exists within it. It is also quite literally treated like a guru, like a king. So you'll see someone fanning on top of it at the Gurdwara. And one of the interesting things about the Guru Granth Sahib is that it is all poetry. It is all set to music, and it is all meant to be sung. And so if you go to a Guru Granth Sahib, the idea is that each verse within the Guru Granth Sahib evokes a particular emotion, a particular sense of calm, or it might get you amped up. Like there's different emotions within the scripture, but all of it is meant to be sung out loud, and all of it is meant to be read as poetry. And so I think tomorrow there is actually going to be a session here about Sikhism, which is about the singing of the scripture. So there'll be more kind of later this week as well, talking about that. So, one of the obvious things I think folks have a lot of questions about is the Sikh identity, right? It's the elephant in the room. Any room I walk into, most of the times I'm the only person who looks like this. And it's one of the things people have a lot of questions on. Within the Sikh framework, the idea is actually to stand out, right? So I am not offended if someone has questions to ask me about my faith or about my physical appearance, because the reason behind this physical appearance is actually to stand out, to hold both myself accountable, and also to let others know that I am going to live to a certain code of conduct and belief system that exists within the Sikh identity. And so oftentimes we make this kind of analogy when we're working with students, younger kids, but I think it's helpful to share here as well. We often say to little kids, if you go into a hospital and you see someone wearing scrubs or they have a stethoscope, you're able to identify that that is someone you can go to for support or help if you are in need. Within the Sikh identity, the idea is the same, is that if you see someone wearing a turban or with articles of faith, that is someone that will operate and behave in a certain way with certain ethics, values, and morals. And so for Sikhs, our physical identity is actually a representation of the internal identity. There is no difference. So my physical appearance is a manifestation of my internal beliefs, and they're one and the same. And so we'll touch on what that physical identity is in a little bit about each of the different articles of faith. So one of the things I'll share here, and this can get very confusing within our presentation, I'm going to do my best to kind of explain it, is that, there are varying levels of commitment folks will often have within the Sikh faith, right? This is true for all faiths and all identities. There is no one story, one monolith, one belief system within a faith, and people within the faith have varying levels of practice, and varying levels of commitment and practice within the community. And so within the Sikh community, it is no different. There are members of the Sikh community who are members of the Khalsa, which is a community of initiated Sikhs. And so members of the Khalsa are required to live by a certain code of conduct, maintaining a distinct identity. And this initiation ceremony is the same for men and women, and we'll touch on that in a second as well. But not all members of the Sikh community are formally initiated as members of the Khalsa. And so for those who are members of the Khalsa, the initiated group of Sikhs, there are 5 articles of faith that you will see them carry. These articles of faith, I want to start by mentioning, are constitutionally protected. And so folks who practice the Sikh faith are both required to carry all 5 articles of faith, but also these are protected by the U.S. Constitution. And so these articles of faith are consistent between men and women. There is absolutely no distinction made there. But I'll go through each of them and just kind of talk about the purpose, the meaning, and the reason. But again, I want to caveat this by saying I'm not speaking for all Sikhs. Each member within the Sikh community kind of has their own reasoning in terms of why they choose to practice their faith the way they do. And sometimes people have different personal stories and reasoning behind it. But I'm going to give a quick broad overview of some of the basic ideas that kind of resonate within members of the faith and the community. The other thing I'll again just caveat this with this is you'll find members of the community that will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 0 of these articles of faith. They may still identify as a Sikh, right? So just having one of these articles of faith does not mean they are a Sikh or they're not a Sikh, but I want to start there. So the first thing I'll mention is Gish, which is uncut hair. And so members of the Sikh community are actually instructed to not cut any part of their hair. So I've never cut my beard. I've never cut my hair. The idea with Gish is that this one light, Vaheguru, God, whatever you want to call it, made you the way that you are for a particular reason, and that it's an acceptance of God's will to not cut your hair. Again, this is consistent men and women. So Gish is an important part of the Sikh identity. The second is the Garda, which is an iron bracelet. It looks like this. The idea of the Garda is that wherever you go, oftentimes it's on a person's dominant hand. If I'm going to do something, I am reminded of my identity. And the idea is that you are kind of reflecting on whether what you are doing quite literally with your hands is in coordination with what your ideals and values and principles are as a Sikh. The third is the Ganga, which is a comb. You'll find it underneath a person's turban in their hair. The idea of a Ganga is quite literally just cleanliness and hygiene. Again, because Sikhs believe hair has a certain spirituality, a certain reason, Sikhs actually really value their hair in terms of taking care of it and properly maintaining it. And so the idea of a Ganga is quite literally that you are taking care of this gift you are given by God. The third is like a chara. Those are undergarments worn by the Sikhs. The idea of this is just readiness and chastity. And then the final article of faith is a kafan. A kafan resembles a small knife. And the idea of a kafan is that you are tasked with actually defending the rights of others and fighting oppression. And so the idea of a kafan is that you are able to actually do so both metaphorically and physically in order to defend the rights of others. Now, the thing I'll say about a kafan is that of these 5 articles of faith, typically only those who are initiated into the Khalsa, the formal community of Sikhs, carry a kafan. So the vast majority of Sikhs who are not members of the Khalsa will not carry a kafan because there's a certain level of responsibility that comes with it. And so only if you are initiated into the Khalsa will you typically find someone who does carry a kafan. Now, one of the things you'll find I did not include there was actually the turban, right? It was not listed as one of the articles of faith, but it is an extension of Caste, which is uncut hair. So the vast majority of people you find here in the United States who wear a turban are actually members of the Sikh community. Certainly there are other communities, other folks who wear turbans, often on cultural reasons, but a turban for the Sikh community is not just cultural, it's actually a religious requirement as a practicing Sikh. Again, the idea is that as a Sikh, you are actually required to be able to stand out, be distinct, and show who you are within your identity. And, you know, for Sikhs like myself, like my turban is not something I would just remove and walk around with publicly. Certainly within my home, I will take my turban off. Certainly, you know, when I'm washing my hair, I'm taking a shower, my turban is off. But, you know, within like a larger context, you'll find that Sikhs, you know, pay a lot of reverence and respect to their turban because there's actually a representation of the community. I think I shared this earlier in the class as well, but for a lot of Sikhs, our turban is actually like a limb. So the idea is that it is so closely connected to who you are and your belief system and values that removing your turban would be like removing your arm or removing your leg because it is that central to your identity. So these are just some images of folks who wear different styles of turbans. The idea here is that there is no one particular color, pattern, style that necessarily means anything in the religious sense. This is all personal preference. Some people will tie it one way, some people will tie it another. Oftentimes it might actually be regional. So, you know, within Punjab, you might be able to tell kind of where a person is from by the style they tie their turban. But that's only if you kind of know the regions and the areas really well. But you'll find men and women, again, wearing turbans. There is no distinction there. And certainly, again, the color is just a matter of personal preference. And the style of the person and how they kind of want to show themselves. One of the images I did not include in here is actually a smaller turban called a parka. That's oftentimes what younger kids will wear. The parka is a much, much smaller turban, and really the reason it's smaller is just it's easier for kids to tie themselves. You know, the turban that I'm wearing right now is actually very long. It's like 5 meters, but you fold it in and then you tie it every morning. It's not like something you just kind of pop on and pop off. It really is like an everyday, you wake up, you tie your turban, and really that idea of reflection in the morning while you're tying your turban is actually a reflection on who you are, how you're presenting yourself, and what you're hoping to accomplish within that day as a Sikh, and making sure you're kind of living within that framework. So I know I've mentioned this a few times with the word Gurdwara. Gurdwara literally means door to the Guru. And so a Gurdwara is a Sikh house of worship. It's where people of the community go to pray, serve, learn. You know, typically here in the West, you'll find that the majority of people go to Gurdwara on a Sunday. That's not for any religious reason. It's really just convenience, right? Most people have Sundays off from school and work. And so because of that, that's when the majority of folks will go. But there are services every day, Monday through Sunday, every day of the week. The Gurdwara is kind of open as a place where folks can go. Where they can learn and where they can serve. You know, if you look at Sikh architecture, in the bottom right and bottom left-hand corner is a picture of Harman Singh in Punjab. It's called the Golden Temple oftentimes here in the West. So if you actually look at the architecture of Harman Singh, there's actually 4 pathways to get in. The idea is that no matter what corner of the world you are from, the Gurdwara is open to you. So from all 4 corners, you are able to come. And around it, you'll find the Sarovar, which is like the water. It's a beautiful sight. I went for the first time as an adult in March, and really just an amazing place to kind of see because it is so large and so historic that you're able to kind of see, you know, how much of an impact it has had on the Sikh community. Now, one of the features of the Gurdwara that's really important to kind of understanding the Sikh community is this idea of Langar. Langar is a meal that is served at every Gurdwara throughout the world. The idea is essentially that this meal is prepared by volunteers, served by volunteers, the food is donated by volunteers, and the idea is that everyone will come together regardless of where they're from, who they are, what their position in life is, and they'll sit together on the floor and enjoy, oftentimes a very basic meal of like lentils, and rice, or lentils and yogurt, or roti, which is like some flatbread. But the idea is that you're just enjoying a very simple meal with the people in your community. Everyone is welcome to have langar at the Gurdwara, regardless of your religion, your background. There's no requirement to be a Sikh to go have this meal, so it is open to everyone. And again, one of the interesting things that Mandir Sahib, again in this picture, just the Mandir Sahib alone serves over 100,000 meals a day. 100,000 meals a day, all of it, again, fully by volunteers. The vast majority of people that are eating there are actually not from the Sikh faith. There are people from all different backgrounds that are just going there. There's no time limit of, hey, you've exceeded your meals for the day. It's, if you want to come there and you have a meal, you can have a meal. There's no requirement beyond just like basic etiquette of, removing your shoes and covering your head as you walk in. But that is a really core part of the Sikh identity and the Sikh faith. And every Gurdwara everywhere in the world serves langar and is open to anyone to go and partake in. And so I want to pause here because I've said this word a few times, but I just want to clarify. So like I mentioned at the top, the vast majority of Sikhs in the world originate from this area called Punjab. Not all Punjabis are Sikh, not all Sikhs are Punjabi, right? So I want to kind of make that clear. And the reason that's really important is because within Punjab, there are people who practice all sorts of religions. There are Punjabis who are Hindu, there are Punjabis who are Muslim, there are Punjabis who are Christian, there are Punjabis who are atheists, there are Punjabis who are agnostic, the full spectrum. There are Punjabis who are Buddhist, everything that you can imagine. And there are also Sikhs of all different racial, ethnic backgrounds, right? So these two things are not mutually exclusive. And so, but the vast majority of Sikhs who are within the world exist in the Punjab region. And so that's oftentimes the reason, when we talk about AAPI history and Asian American history, the Sikh community is oftentimes included within that because the vast majority of Sikhs originate from South Asia, and that's kind of the origins of the faith and the tradition. So within the Sikh community, the language you'll often hear people speak is Punjabi. On the screen, that just says below in Punjabi, and you'll find that this is one of the really important things that as a civil rights organization we often do is make sure that there's actual language access for members of the community, because that's one of the areas that oftentimes communities and immigrant communities in particular struggle, is being able to have access to the different needs, information that they have to be able to be successful. And so I want to touch briefly on some of the challenges Sikhs face in America. I know I touched on this at the top. None of this is particularly new. I think a lot of folks in the room would recognize that there are certain challenges that come in this country if you are a minority or from a marginalized community background. I'll touch mostly on the school part of this because I think it's most relevant for a lot of this conversation. We conducted a survey about 10 years ago, and it found that 67% of students who wear turbans report being bullied in schools. And Sikh students are bullied at more than 2 times the national average. The unfortunate reality is oftentimes that bullying is actually coming at the hands of administrators and teachers. And oftentimes administrators and teachers are not able to recognize that bullying is even occurring based on a student's identity. And so I'll give you a few examples. I grew up in a school where I was the only Sikh. My brother and I were the only folks that wore turbans. And about every day for 2 years when I was in middle school, I had a school librarian. Every time I would go to the library, I would say, hey, take off your hat. And every time I'd actually tell her, hey, it's not a hat, it's my turban. She'd say, okay, and she'd walk away. And then the next day it would happen again. Right? These are the sorts of daily examples a lot of our students face in the community. It's just this marginalization in terms of what their identity is. And the other unfortunate reality is that oftentimes it's not identified by folks as actually being based on their religious identity. So, we'll often hear from students or parents that say, hey, my child's turban was ripped off in the class. And the teacher responded in a way to say, hey, it happens. Sometimes students will take hats off one another, or, you can go retie in the bathroom. But there's not a recognition that removal of the turban in that case is actually not just bullying, it's bias-based bullying based on a student's identity. And it needs to be taken very seriously because that obviously impacts the culture of the school and impacts how other students kind of interact within that world as well. So, these examples are very common within like a K through 12 setting. Unfortunately, they don't really stop there. I shared this example earlier, but even with, folks who are doctors, nurses, EMTs, in the past couple of years in particular, they faced a lot of challenges around PPE. So, for Sikhs who have turbans or have beards, oftentimes they're told, hey, you need to shave in order to wear a proper mask. And while we certainly recognize that safety needs are important, especially if you're working in that sort of environment, there are actually adaptable things that you can do to make sure that folks are safe. It just requires you to actually order those protective equipment through the employer, and employers oftentimes are not aware that they need to, or constitutionally required to actually do that for their employees. And so a lot of the work that we do is actually to make sure folks recognize that access to these certain things are really crucial to making sure you have an inclusive workspace for all people. So, in terms of how we respond to some of these challenges, we touched on it, the work that we do through policy, through education, through proactive measures is really important. Like I mentioned at the top, we have both the reactive and a proactive approach to this. So, oftentimes we will have to work with folks when, there's a bullying case, or when a community member will share that they're having a particular problem or they've been assaulted. We also try to take a very proactive approach. Oftentimes it's actual local community involvement. And so it's positioning community members for local boards. It's making sure that different folks from communities are feeling represented within whatever community they're involved in. It's also making sure that we're strong allies to other communities. And so, going back again to this challenge of PPE, one of the really important things we did is recognize that this issue of shaving also severely affects the Black community. There's a skin condition called PFB, where oftentimes Black men who shave will have really significant razor bumps that will scar and impact their skin, and they're quite literally not able to shave. And so PFB disproportionately affects the Black community. And so a lot of the work we did was working with Black community organizations to say, hey, we're all being impacted by this policy. We need to work together to recognize that without that sort of allyship, we're all actually being impacted by folks who either don't know better or know better and are still looking to implement policies that impact our communities. On the education side, another example is through a lot of the education work we've done is to advocate for the inclusion of Sikhism, but alongside that, make sure that other communities are also being included in a way that they feel represented and is accurate to who they are. And so, in a place like Mississippi, where we were able to get Sikhism included in December of 2022, that meant preparing community members to go to the Board of Education and say, number one, we need you to listen to the concerns of the Black community because you are moving important civil rights figures like Medgar Evers and things like Edmer, and you need to hear what their concerns are and respond to them. And number two, we also do want to see Sikhism included in our social studies standards. But we need to start with the biggest problem, which is that you are not addressing the needs of the community at large who have been severely impacted by policies that are hurting their kids in these public schools. So, this is one of the things that's really important to understand about the Sikh community is that, as I mentioned at the top, we're often framed in the context of, the only time you'll see a Sikh on TV is after hate or violence has taken place. So whether that's in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, when a Sikh daughter was attacked by a neo-Nazi gunman in 2012 and 6 people in the Sikh community were murdered, whether that's in Indianapolis when there was a mass shooting at a FedEx facility where the majority of victims were Sikh, whether that was in Queens, New York, when Sikh men were being attacked multiple times in a week outside of Gurdwara's houses of worship. Oftentimes, that's the only time you hear about the Sikh community. But that's not the way, the Sikh community, like many communities, don't want to be defined within the framework of what we're not, or be defined within the framework of, hey, this community experiences a lot of hate. It really wants to be able to be defined in terms of who we are, what are the actual beliefs. And so hopefully this is the start of a good week of actually being able to show beyond just responding to hate, what the Sikh community actually believes in, what the scriptures are, how the Sikh community practices its faith, and, some of the joy and some of the stories about the Sikh community that oftentimes are not told. So I think we have some time. I really wanted to leave time for question and answer, then also just some interactive portion of this. So hopefully that wasn't too fast. It's always hard within an hour to kind of get most of the stuff, but hopefully this was helpful, and I'd love to just have a conversation and share more. Yeah, one of the biggest projects we're working on right now is updating our previous study from 10 years ago. So we just wrapped up data collection of the largest student survey about Sikh student experiences. So we're 2,200 student responses from over 20 states. and we're going to be publishing that report in early 2024. And the idea of that report is we have specific policy recommendations that we would want states to implement for administrators and teachers to know about the community. And, the world has changed a lot in the last 10 years. Obviously, what was happening in 2014 is very different than what is happening in 2024, both politically, technologically, the impact of social media on how kids are kind of experiencing bullying. And then also just like a post-COVID environment, several years of inflammatory rhetoric in terms of like different communities like ours. So really interested in seeing what that data kind of shows in 2024, but that's going to be a major project, is working with schools, administrators, and really making sure we get that data out to the communities. Of sinning? That's a really good question. The word sin obviously doesn't exist within like the Punjabi language in Gurdwara. It's interesting, I think really within the Sikh context, Sikhi is oftentimes considered a philosophy in terms of like how you live your life. And so, certainly there are things within the Sikh faith and Sikh identity that are considered wrong, things that are morally not in line with how a person with a Sikh should function. But the concept of sin, I think, is a little bit different. And so it's a good question, but it does get a bit more like philosophical in terms of like, well, what exactly is sin? Like, how do you define what sin is? Because, my understanding, I could be wrong. I think within sin, there's the idea that if you commit a sin, within the Sikh idea, there is no heaven and hell necessarily. Sikhs believe in the idea of reincarnation. And so there's a bit of a difference in terms of like, if you are not, the idea within Sikh faith is like, you are here on earth to connect to the divine. That is your purpose for being here, is to connect. If you do not connect, and you did not live your life in a way that you are, ethically living in a way that we talked about, that you would actually go through the process of rebirth, like the reincarnation. If you live your life in a way that is connecting with the divine, then you would actually merge with the divine and escape the cycle of reincarnation. So sin in that way is a little bit hard for me to kind of say like how it fits into that. It's just a completely different philosophical set of beliefs, I think. Yeah, that's a really good question. So the caste system is, again, a very complicated subject, but it's important to talk about. One of the reasons, when we talked about Langar in terms of folks just sitting together on the floor and eating, that was actually a rejection of the caste system in the sense that, at the time, if you are considered someone from a higher caste, you would not be able to, forget sharing a meal with them, you would be able to share like the same space as them in terms of like eating in the same room. And so the idea within the Sikh scripture was like, you could be a king, you could be a peasant, you were going to sit together regardless of your background and eat together because you are all the same within the eyes of God. So the Sikh religion outright rejects the caste system. It's actually one of the fundamental beliefs in terms of equality. And yet I will say there are members of the Sikh community, because they're impacted by a broader culture, who still practice elements of caste, right? And so that's a problem in terms of, the idea of viewing any religion in a vacuum just, can't happen. And so there are members of the Sikh community who practice the caste system in terms of how they view certain people, but the religion itself outright rejects it. There's just varying levels of understanding. And so certainly the Guru's Sikh scripture outright rejects it, but some people do still practice it, unfortunately. And I'll just quickly share, one of the things we're actually working on right now is legislation in California that would ban caste discrimination. So it's called SB 403. So we're sponsoring that legislation. And it's broadly been supported by Sikh community members across the country. So within California, I think about 60 different Gurdwaras signed on in support of that to make caste a protected category in California's penal system. Question from on training, who is the co-chair of the Asia Pacific American Coalition. All right. Thank you for this excellent overview of Sikhism. Harman, can you share a little bit about intergenerational dynamics within the Sikh community, both in terms of the challenges and the intergenerational connections that have been posted? Yeah, that's a really good question. No, it's really hard sometimes in the sense that, I grew up in this country. I grew up here. My preferred, my easiest communication is in English. I still am able to speak Punjabi, but there is a certain level of disconnect in terms of being able to fully express all my thoughts and ideas in Punjabi. And that intergenerational communication sometimes is hard, especially when it gets on to very difficult and nuanced topics that oftentimes we need to have as a community. And so I think language is one of the barriers that oftentimes makes that communication really hard. The other part that makes it really hard sometimes is just the experiences that a lot of our elders went through that we didn't necessarily go through, and vice versa, right? So for a lot of folks who migrated to the United States, there were varying reasons they did so. Oftentimes it was violence that they experienced in India, right? So there are a lot of Sikhs who are in the United States on political asylum because they were experiencing violence at the hands of the Indian government. So a lot of our elders went through multiple rounds of violence before they got here, right? So my grandparents lived through the partition of India. So the largest mass migration in human history, and they saw a lot of death, destruction, and violence as they were forced to go through that partition. Then in 1984, there was genocidal violence committed against the Sikh community in Amritsar at the Golden Temple. And so the Indian army actually attacked the Golden Temple. A lot of our elders lived through that violence. And it was post that violence, many folks actually immigrated to the United States. And so I think the intergenerational trauma a lot of them experience does impact a lot of folks who grew up in this country, maybe in ways that we don't even recognize or know, right? So the ways in which we communicate with each other, the ways in which we share information, the ways in which we practice our faith, all of that's obviously impacted by what happened before us. And so those are some pretty significant challenges that I think as a community, we're still kind of reckoning with and trying to figure out how do we address what those challenges are. But, you know, this is the unfortunate reality, right, of a lot of API communities is that a lot of us are here because of war. A lot of us are here in the United States because of violence. A lot of us are here because of borders and colonization and all of these issues that kind of pushed community members out when they did. And so, you know, the reasons that many of our community members are here is because of those reasons, and those reasons certainly impact how we function within this world and how we kind of view ourselves as well.
Thank you so much for sharing about the way that memories are embodied in families. And you know, I think for me that also creates a much more detailed picture too about what's motivating the Sikh community to take the kinds of actions that it does in terms of social justice and human rights because of those experiences, and also in the place where they're trying to make a new home and trying to prevent those same things from reoccurring, right? And so I think, you know, there's so many amazing lessons to learn in that, and the ways that what strike me as a part of Sikh community building is in that allyship and finding other people who experience those same or similar issues, and that based on those experiences become aligned. And I think that's it's incredibly courageous because the thing with that activates trauma is that it is as if you're experiencing that violence all over again. Yeah, and so it's interesting part of the faith to also to reckon with that and to join others in that. And that feels like a built-in healing process. Yeah. I mean, I'll just share with you, I think we were talking about this walking here is, you know, the stories of those that come before us, oftentimes you don't fully appreciate it until you're a little bit older and understand like what it actually meant. And so for me, like, you know, I grew up not knowing the full story of my grandfather. Like he was one of the most important people in my life, lived with him in like a multi-generational home growing up. He was always my hero in terms of like who I wanted to be. It wasn't until I got, you know, within the last few years before he passed away that he shared a lot of information of things that he'd kind of been through, right? I had no idea he lost a brother in partition when he was leaving. He never shared that with us. And that was just kind of this
He was a young man when that happened, and I'm sure it impacted him in so many ways that I was never able to figure out. But he shared that with me towards the end of his life, and that kind of reshaped in my head, like, what else did he see? What else did he experience? How did that impact how he raised my dad and our family? How did that impact his relationship with my grandma? How did that impact how he relates to us and like why he came to the United States? And so all of those stories, I think, really do shape who we are, how we become who we are, our purpose, how we see ourselves in this country. And so, yeah, that's not a unique story. I think a lot of people have that if their parents kind of immigrate or their grandparents. But like, there's a lot of stories that I didn't know until I became an adult. And as a child, I was completely clueless in terms of what they went through.
Just, I want to know if I can say something on philosophy. Partition, the Punjabi Muslims too. Second year PhD in philosophy department at UConn. I would be very eager to collaborate.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I'd love to collaborate. I'd love to learn more. Yeah, I mean, again, the partition of India was just incredibly violent for a lot of folks, right? It wasn't confined to one community in terms of like only the Sikh community experienced violence in that time period. It's extremely traumatic to be able to just be like, hey, you are passing up everything that you had, that you are leaving your home, going to a new place where you will have to then set up a brand new life. It's obviously very scary. It's very dangerous. And, this is obviously before cars, right? People weren't just hopping, in their car and driving over to the other side. They were literally walking. They were on carriage, but they were doing really difficult things to make it over. So, the relationships between the Punjabis, Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim community, impacted a lot of ways by the partition because they all experienced it both in the same way, also in very different ways in terms of like, how did they experience it? What were the numbers, right? One of the things we talk about, Sikhism is the world's 5th largest religion. Sikhs make up less than 2% of India's population. There is no Sikh state where Sikhs are the majority. After India, Canada has the highest percentage per capita of Sikhs, and that's still less than 2%. So really everywhere where Sikhs are, they are a micro minority within that community. But because India is so large in Punjab, it's so large in terms of population, there's just a lot of Sikhs primarily there. But, the diaspora is growing kind of all over the world. Australia, New Zealand. There's already a lot of Sikhs in Malaysia, Singapore, elsewhere. But the partition, I think, is definitely one of those inflection points that really impacted Sikh migration and also the Sikh psyche in a lot of ways as well. But I'd love to learn from you, Becca, as well. I'm sure you have a lot more knowledge on this than me. I'd love for us to connect. Yeah, that's a great question. Just for context of folks who aren't familiar with what Jessica just mentioned. Last week, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced that there are credible links between the murder of a Sikh activist in Vancouver, British Columbia, and the Indian government being responsible for that murder. So it was a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil that was murdered, and the Canadian government is alleging that India was responsible for or collaborated with the murder of them in Canada. And so obviously that sets off alarm bells for a lot of folks. Here in the United States, there are credible reports that Sikhs were warned by the FBI in the past several months that they're also in danger. And so it's a real concern, right? Because like you said, there are already Sikhs here in the United States who feel like they are under regular threat in terms of just their visible identity and feeling like they, have to deal with hate crimes and violence based on perceptions of who they are. And this adds a whole other layer of complexity in terms of like, well, are we even safe from foreign influence and transnational repression? So in terms of how to kind of address that, one of the things we've done over the past week is reach out to our elected officials and make them aware of this problem. One of the unfortunate realities is there's a narrative that just kind of lives and that unfortunately the government of India is kind of propagating, which is like Sikhs are terrorists and extremists and violent. And they're justifying now, like Indian media is just saying, hey, we're not even going to deny the fact that murder took place. A lot of the Indian media is saying, yeah, so what if we were involved? He was a terrorist, we should kill him. And so that sort of propaganda and that narrative is oftentimes what we need to challenge as a community. And so, like I mentioned throughout this, no community is a monolith, no community is one thing. And I think continuing to kind of press that and make sure folks are aware that there are many versions of the Sikh community and we need to kind of acknowledge that and address it. So I think reaching out to elected officials, making them aware of the problem, making them aware that the Sikh community is concerned about that sort of involvement here in the United States is also really important because, we've heard all, if you're a member of the Sikh community, I think there's been a lot of people that have recognized that this is a problem for a long time. But now, there's recognition from the Canadian government that it did happen there. And there's real recognition from elected officials here that it's a concern. So I think now's the time to raise this broadly to elected officials, and also to just kind of be out publicly in media as much as people are comfortable in saying, hey, this is actually who the Sikh community is, not whatever propaganda narrative is being propped up about the community.
Unfortunately, at the end of time for this event, so I just want to thank you all for coming. This has been a great kickoff for Sikh Studies Week here. Thanks again. It's always a pleasure working with you. This was fantastic. I learned so much every time we hang out. So yeah, there are programs every day this week. Mario is Paul. He's going to be presenting poetry that she's written as a Sikh in diaspora from Burma. And then we're also going to have a community presentation from in Norwich, as well as a kirtan, a traditional kirtan here in the library on the 4th floor at the Heritage Room. So very excited. Cultural performer Gurmeet Singh is going to be joining us and leading that performance. And then lastly, we have Interpol Greywall, a scholar from Yale, who will be presenting on the histories of violence in the Punjab and how art and activism have been ways of responding to that violence. So thanks again, and I hope to see you guys at our other events this week. All right, thanks everyone.